Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Versus Stars podcast, third season. My loyal listeners, thank you for helping me on my quest to 1,000 subscribers. It's an amazing episode because Joe Casey boards the mothership, known as the writer of Kneel Before Zod from DC Comics. Now come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Casey. Thank you so much for coming to Versus Stars podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Totally my pleasure. So we start off with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for comics and who are your earliest influences?
Well, I was one of those kids where the parents would go on a road trip and buy a comic at the convenience store to shut the kid up in the back seat. And little did they know they would set me on a path that would dominate my whole life. So I was early on, I was a Marvel kid. I've migrated over to DC. I mean, it was just something that just got in my bones pretty immediately.
Now, are there particular titles that you remember grabbing you the most?
Yeah, I was a big Avengers guy.
Avengers?
And that was right at the, I mean, when I was really young, that was right at the Jim Shooter, David Michelinie years. Those two guys on that book were a big influence on me. To this day, still, really.
So you're now the writer of Kneel Before Zod for DC Comic Books. So how did you get involved with that project?
Well, I wrote Superman for DC probably about 20 years ago now, a little longer than that. Jesus Christ. And God bless him, Mark Waid roped me back in at DC. He introduced me to his editor that he's working with there. And the editor had this project that he'd always wanted to do. He always wanted to do a Zod book, and he was the Superman editor. So we kicked around some ideas and came together pretty fast. A book like Kneel Before Zod is kind of writes itself if you're in the right mindset for it. So it happened pretty quick. But then next thing I knew, I'm back at DC after decades.
So do you remember what the pitch was that ultimately made this title happen?
Well, I mean, basically, it was just we want to do a Zod book. That was the pitch given to me, and that they wanted to, steer him back to being a more straight ahead villain. And at first I thought, well, hasn't he always been? But then they sent me all the research for the past, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years of where the character had been, kind of all the post-rebirth stuff. I thought, God damn, this guy's got a wife and a kid, and he's showing up like he's some sort of out-of-work farmer and welcoming Superman to his new planet. And I just thought, this is not the Zod that I know or would want to read about, or maybe not the Zod that would be in the cultural zeitgeist. I mean, certainly not from the Man of Steel movie. This was not Michael Shannon I was seeing, or Terrence Stamp for that matter, which is kind of the two signposts for Zod for most people. So I saw the opportunity, and this is what DC wanted, was to basically take him back to his bastard roots and make him a pure villain again. So that's what we're doing.
So when you think of, as you mentioned, Terrence Stamp and Michael Shannon, I'll say the name of it is Kneel Before Zod, one of his most famous lines. So when you think about the character in your head, do you hear Mike Shannon or do you hear Terrence Stamp?
I don't hear either one, to be honest, because I am honoring the continuity that's built up to this series. So I've seen how he's been written in the past, and so I'm building on that. And we're not trying to turn him into Terrence Stamp or Michael Shannon. Those are kind of signposts you can use that that the general public knows about or maybe has more familiarity with. So sometimes you lean into it and sometimes you don't, just depending on what the story demands. But I mean, my Zod voice is really neither one of those two, I don't think. Not to me, anyway.
So when you're thinking about writing for Zod, and you said you went through 7 years basically of continuity backstory to try to figure out where he is. He's obviously immersed in a whole lot of other surrounding titles as well in the surrounding DC universe, which is obviously interconnected. What, beyond just reading stories with Zod in it, what other titles did you have to read to try to figure out where Zod exists in this world?
Well, just, I mean, his appearances up to this point, like I said, this post-Rebirth Zod did kind of cover a lot of ground in the DC universe. He was
Hmm.
in Suicide Squad, he was in obviously the Superman books, he was in Green Lantern books. So just reading his appearances kind of gave me a sense of what the DC universe was all about at the moment and where it was going. And, I mean, now I'm a little bit more on the inside. I kind of know where things are going and where they're supposed to be going. So that's kind of all the research I needed to do. I mean, it's we're connected obviously to the DC universe, and we're headed on a trajectory that's going to hopefully tie it back into the Superman mainline books. But we've got a ways to go. We've got a whole year of putting him through hell before anything like that happens.
So, as you just mentioned, being in the world of Superman, and obviously the larger continuity. Um, right now, the first issue references quite strongly the United Planets, which
Right.
people who are fans of Green Lantern know that's a major entity in the Green Lantern universe right now because they kind of control the Green Lantern Corps,
Yep.
or kind of create the rules. So that plays Zod more in the Green Lantern universe right now, or the Superman universe right now.
Well, it's funny because bringing the United Planets into the 21st century, I mean, to me, the United Planets is a Legion of Superheroes thing.
Hmm.
Always has been. So in a way, I'm sort of thrilled that they're an element that sort of we can play with in the modern day because I'm a big Legion of Superheroes guy. But yeah, they're big in the Green Lantern continuity right now, and fortunately, I know a little bit about where they're going there. Um, and Zod's involvement with them, it gets less and less as the series goes on because he gets further and further away from where he started out. I mean, at the start of the series, he's kind of playing nice, even though he obviously has an agenda, but he's interacting with the United Planets Council and talking to them directly. That will not last. That will not last very long.
So one thing in the first issue, and I really did love the first issue. In issue one, I'm going to refer to Jor-El, but I mean, it's not really Jor-El, but it's, I guess, the Jor-El that Zod sees,
Yeah.
states to Zod that Zod is a soldier without a war, seething with discontent, which is a wonderful line, by the way. So, uh,
Okay.
yeah. So, and he says, so the question really is, how does a soldier like Zod redefine himself when there's no longer a war to fight?
Well, there are different kinds of wars to fight. And part of this year of stories that we're telling is Zod confronting those different kinds of conflicts, you know. And I mean, right off the bat, we see in the first issue, and it will continue in the first couple of stories, his planet's being invaded. So right off the bat, the war is coming to him,
Hmm.
or a war. Once he gets past that, it's kind of it's a whole new ball game for the character once we get past this sort of first uh, few issues, and things get really dark, really quick.
So when you think about like Zod, I mean, obviously a good comic book needs conflict. But when you think about Zod himself, can Zod be happy or function if there's not a conflict for him to fight?
Well, I think the first issue demonstrates that he's at his worst when he doesn't have a war to fight.
Hmm.
He's conflicted about what he's doing. He's obviously having sort of hallucinations.
Yeah.
He's a little bit. I mean, he's not quite the family man that he should be. Obviously, the first issue he casts his son out. Which has a connection to his family history, but still very cold-blooded and very ruthless of him to do that. So yeah, I mean, that was my initial pitch to DC once I, read up all the stories that he appeared in, which is he's gotten everything he wanted. which is probably the worst thing that could happen to a character, especially a bad guy.
Right.
Because then where do you go from there? Well, we're going to see where it goes, and it goes to hell is where it goes. Straight to hell.
Well, I mean, the kind of makes Zod kind of a tragic figure that he cannot find happiness in peace. He must be within turmoil of a war, or he can't be happy. That's kind of tragic when you think of any individual.
It's tragic, but then you got to think a little bit further. I mean, if he is a villain, does he deserve
Hmm.
peace? Does he deserve contentment? Does he deserve to get what he wants? I would argue that point, but asking the question just makes for interesting storytelling, I think. Just
Hmm.
seeing him, putting him through his paces is what the book is all about.
Now, kind of interesting, like you mentioned that he casts out his son from his planet. Obviously, early on in the story, you mentioned that Ursa mentions that she's pregnant. If she hadn't been pregnant and he was going to be his only son, his only heir, would he have been so quick to cast him out?
No, because it's really uh, it's the Zod family way for the firstborn to be sort of shoved out of the nest. And we'll see that play out. We'll see that play out more directly, I think, in issue 3. No, sorry, in issue 5, we see how that plays out. We see that it's sort of history repeating itself. So yeah, had she not, was she not, if she was not carrying a second son, the events would have played out a lot differently. There might have still been discipline and there might have still been conflict, but where Zod took it, which was, get the fuck out, would not have happened. Not like that anyway.
It's like I said, when you think about Zod, it's so like I said, going back to the idea of being tragic. His biggest issues really are himself. His son is too much like him, thus there's unhappiness there. His wife also sort of has some aspects of being Ursa. His biggest problem seems to be that is him.
Yeah. And it's interesting to write a character that's, a villain, because most villains are their own worst enemy, but usually out of hubris. They think they know what's going on more than it actually is. In Zod's case, I don't think it's necessarily hubris. It's more he hasn't recognized himself yet. He hasn't recognized how he operates best, which is, as a soldier, as a combatant, as an adversary to somebody. Just ruling over a planet is what he thought he wanted, is what he thought the goal was. But his whole life has been about conflict. His whole life is about fighting striving for that goal. But the journey was what was feeding him. Reaching the goal was the worst thing that could have happened to him.
Is that one of the difficulties in writing a villain as your protagonist? One, he has to, I mean, he's a villain, so he has to do villainous things. At the same time, you have to capture the empathy on some level of your reader to keep them following along. So how do you find that balance between keeping him true to being the villain and making sure your readers, I guess, I don't know if they want him to win, or at the very least, want to be a part of his adventure?
Well, I mean, that's a good question because it does, you know, sometimes likability comes into play. You have to like the character, you have to root for him.
Hmm.
In the case of this book, I think what we're striving for is that he's engaging, that
Hmm.
you just want to find out what happens next. It's not necessarily that you're rooting for him or on his side philosophically or any other way, but a lot of science fiction novels don't have sort of clear-cut good guys, bad guys. They usually are exploring an issue through character, but it's not black and white as to who's got the moral high ground and who doesn't. So I'm approaching this more like a science fiction novel, whereas we're exploring character, we're seeing where we can take him, how far we can push him, but it's not about achieving a victory or some moral goal. It's really just an exploration of character and seeing where it lands once you've pushed a guy like this to his limits, to the edge of his own sanity, even. That's been the fun of writing it is not having to address morality,
Hmm.
which when you're writing superheroes, your mileage may vary, but at some level, you're always dealing with morality. What's
Hmm.
the right thing to do? What's the best thing to do? What's the action that will serve the greater good? We don't have any of those problems in this series, and so it's been a lot of fun in that respect.
Well, another challenge with writing Zod is, for those who don't know, but most people know Zod, is that Zod is sort of the evil Superman on some level.
Correct.
Or when you write Superman, Superman at least is limited by morality as far as his power level. He can do, or he can basically destroy a planet, but he's not going to, because he's a good guy, and so he's limited by doing the right thing. Zod doesn't have any of that moral quandary at all. So is it hard to find a conflict worthy of that level of power when you don't have the weakness of morality that Superman may have?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's easy, but the setup that I was given had everything that I needed to get at Zod. In other words, he has something to lose,
Hmm.
which for any character, it's the whole reason for the secret identity is to protect your loved ones.
Hmm.
That works both ways. I mean, when a villain has some soft spots, some vulnerabilities, you got to go for it. You got to expose them. You got to exploit them. I mean, that's where the drama comes from, really. And we exploit the holy hell out of them.
But I think one of the coolest things that you have is that right from the beginning, Zod, this leader of a planet, is, I don't know the I don't know the word is hallucinating, but he's seeing Jor-El, and he's having this argument with Jor-El, who turns out not to be there, but that's who he's arguing with.
Yeah.
So that part of his brain that is manifesting Jor-El, is that a manifestation of morality, of his morality, or his guilt that's trying to talk him out of things or coax him into something?
It's more of a manifestation of his conflict about who he is and what he's doing. Because Zod's really just reflecting back who he is, you know.
Hmm.
It's all in that first scene. You're a soldier to the war, you're dealing with your discontent, you're not who you are supposed to be. And the Jor-El manifestation of that is very, for Zod, is like being taunted by him.
Hmm.
He's being it's like the carrot on the stick. It's one thing to confront yourself and say, I'm not being true to myself, but it's another thing to be confronted by your worst enemy, your most hated adversary, and he's the one telling you how you fucked up, how your life is meaningless and you don't know what you're doing with it. That's sort of like he's rubbing salt in his own wound with that.
Now, does that mean Zod crazy, or is the only person, when you're at the level of Zod, is the only person who can talk truth to you with a hallucination of your worst enemy?
He's kind of gotten to that point, yeah, at the beginning of the series. He's sort of gone that far down the rabbit hole in his own brain. Um, you know, Crazy might not be the right word I would use. I would say off, off center, you know. I mean, again, denying your true self is gonna make you a little nuts, even if you're not conscious of it. And up until now, he's not been conscious of it, but we're gonna bring it out into the forefront, I think.
Hey, I'm gonna read a quote from the first issue, if you don't mind. That I think is a good piece of evidence about, or at least a good example of his mindset to things. Zod states, I'm just gonna read it,
Sure.
that any universal peace is built solely on the concepts of distrust and deterrence. So, how much is that a reflection of Zod's own flaws in character, and how much is that a representation of a a philosophy and why he does what he does throughout the story?
Well, I mean, one of my theories about humanity is that, as any individual, the worst thing you could think of someone doing to you is only comes from what you feel like you might be capable of.
Hmm.
In other words, if you're in a relationship and you're a very jealous person, that's probably because you might not be as faithful as you would like to be.
Hmm.
It's your own flaws being reflected back at you. You're just projecting them onto the world or another person or whatever. So the way Zod expresses how he looks at the universe is really he's just talking about himself always. You know,
Hmm.
I can't be weak. I have to, I have to front always. I have to, show power, never show weakness. I have to. My enemies must fear me. They must not. It's all that stuff, and that's just he's just transposing that attitude to the rest of the universe. But he's really talking about himself.
I think this is such a great line, especially because, like I said, it does really define Zod's vision of the universe. And how dangerous is that if that's his vision of the universe, have a guy of his power who thinks the world acts that way?
Well, it's very dangerous. It's part of what he's one thing that he's doing right, which is which comes out in the conflict with his son. He is making plans, and he is hiding things from the United Planets. He's got some ideas about how to interact with the universe. That's not just about having his own planet and minding his own business. I mean, he's still got a conqueror's heart. He still wants to. It's never enough. No matter what he says, no matter what he achieved, or no matter what he tells himself, it's never enough.
Hmm.
So where the story starts, he's formulating plans that will go beyond just sitting on a throne, you know, and we'll see those play out uh, at the end of the first year in a big way. It's going to be really interesting to the first year is kind of broken up into three arcs, I guess you could say, three kind of movements. And like any three act structure, the first act and the third act are kind of reflective of each other.
Hmm.
The second act is kind of the journey through the darkness, just to get to the light at the end, the other end of the tunnel. In this case, the light is like a sun exploding, like a supernova, and a lot of things that don't seem like they're going to pay off in such a huge, cool way. You can only do it in a book that stars a villain. I'm super psyched about it.
I mean, the thing with Zod and the scale in which he can exist on, how does Zod function in a way and not kind of wake up the rest of the DC universe to what he's doing? How big is storyline going to get?
Pretty big, pretty big. I mean, I don't think that he would settle for less than fighting the whole universe. That's kind of what I want to bring out in the character and establish as his how he operates, which is that he's ready to take on everybody. That's to him at the ultimate war. And into there's that old saying about war serves no one but itself. And Zod to me is the personification of war.
Hmm.
It's not about winning or losing anymore. It's about being in the war. It's about fighting the war.
Hmm.
And if it goes on forever, that's actually better for him than victory, you know, because he's now experienced victory in his own way. He's achieved that thing that he always wanted, and it didn't satisfy, it didn't quench whatever was burning in his heart. He, as the first issue sort of demonstrates, he's still got a lot of conflict in him that has to be not even dealt with, just expressed. So, sitting in a throne room in a capital city on a planet that he runs with everything running smoothly like clockwork is not really going to work for him. I mean, there's no way it's going to work for him, actually.
So when you get the United Planets involved, we're talking about the scope of what Zod is going to be. Are we looking at appearances by the Green Lantern Corps coming up?
Uh, in a roundabout way, yes, I would say yes. In a roundabout way, we will touch on that continuity. We'll touch on that area of the DC universe for sure.
I think another interesting thing about Zod, and I don't know if this is just pure vanity on his part, he's talking about bringing out the Kryptonians that are in the Battle City of Kandor, right? And bringing them out to his planet. And
Yeah.
he's thinking this is gonna be a wonderful thing for him because he'll have all these followers and all these soldiers and everything else. Is it just pure arrogance to assume that if the Battle City of Kandor were to be let out of the Battle City and onto his planet, they would follow him or even recognize him as a leader?
Well, I think there's two sides of it. One, I think you're right. There's arrogance on his part that it might go that way. But on the other hand, if it doesn't go that way and they were to disagree with him or revolt or not appreciate what he's done, that's kind of okay with him too. That's just another war to fight, you know. So it's no lose for him. If they're with him, great. If they're against him, he knows what that's all about too. So, it doesn't really, there's no outcome that's not going to work for him, I don't think.
But I can't help but think, I mean, these citizens of Kandor are going to be Supermen as well. That's
Right.
That's a pretty big if that he can deal with a whole city that doesn't like him of Superman.
It's a huge if, yeah, but I think in the back of his mind, when he thinks about it, he kind of relishes that challenge, that potential. I mean, that's just another war to fight, you know? So I think he's good either way. Let's put it that way.
But that is an interesting aspect to have a character looking for war. Because with so many superheroes, the whole point is to get away from it.
Right.
He's the one who's like, how many can I battle at once?
Yeah. Which is, that's the sign of a sort of a sociopathic mind. I mean, is to want that chaos and revel in that chaos. But that's the character. I mean, he's a villain. It's funny because I wrote Superman for 3 years, roughly 3 years. And writing this series has been interesting because it's a character with the same power set, the same shared continuity. I mean, they're both from Krypton, but yet none of the morality. It's every decision is quite the opposite of what Superman would do. So it's kind of interesting to me writing it because at first, all the early questions you were asking about, can you follow a villain? Can you root for a villain? I had to go through that thought process in my own head to get past it, to go, okay, no, this is a bad guy. We're taking on a journey. This is not and it's not a hero's journey. And that's okay because it's baked into the character that no one's expecting him to be redeemable or even have, moments where you go, oh, that's nice. I hope nobody's looking for that because there are none. There are none in this series.
Well, I mean, the potential threats we're looking at right now, Zod's son, the Kandorians, United Planets. You just thought pronouncing it correctly, the Khund. Is that how you would pronounce it? The Khund
Yeah,
army.
that's what I said.
How many more threats and how many fronts can you be fighting right now that you've planned out for?
Well, the simple answer is the more the merrier. But what happens after issue 4 kind of puts him in a different milieu, kind of puts him in a different setting that's different than where he is in the first 4. So it shifts a little bit from fighting these big war and peace kind of epic battles to things that are a little more contained, a little more personal. We can bring out more of his personality, I guess. That's the second act that I was talking about before, the sort of the darker second act, where he's really being confronted by things that challenge his notion of himself, because that's part of the process. And what's interesting for me is that in a superhero story, a superhero might go through those dark times too, with the goal to be becoming stronger, more fortified in his beliefs, or more committed to the ideals of what's right. With a villain, going through that process only serves to solidify how much of a shit he is. So
So,
everything is sort of geared towards that goal.
so for the readers reading or the upcoming issue of Zod, this is not a redemption tale for the man.
No, not at all. And and hopefully nobody's. I mean, I would think that no one's expecting that. I
Right.
hope not. Maybe some readers are, but I'll be upfront about it. It is not a redemption tale. It is not about Zod seeing the light and being like, oh, I should serve the universe. I should be more like Superman. No, not at all.
So when you're talking about 12 issues, is this a 12 issue maxi series, or this is an ongoing with 12 already planned and you have more planned beyond?
Well, look, in this marketplace, you can't really predict anything like that. I mean, we pitched it. I got the word back. It got approved for 12 issues, which was a surprise to me, to be perfectly honest. Um, so I planned on a 12 issue story that would get the character to where I think DC wants the character to be. Um, whether it goes on from there, I don't know. Whether it goes on from there with me, I don't know. I've written the first 7 issues, about to start issue 8. And like I said, I know where it's going. I know how it plays out for the first 12, but I don't know. It's hard to predict where. I mean, we've seen some things at DC where they started out as like 6 issues and then got extended and got granted sort of ongoing status. So you just never know. We'll have to see if readers really get on board and support this thing all the way through.
So what can you tease about what's coming next?
What can I tease? I can tell you that there is going to be more interaction with other aspects of the DC universe, the cosmic aspects of the DC universe, because that was one of my, when they brought up this idea of doing a Zod book. Once I realized, okay, so he's got his planet, how do we deal with that? Once I got that storyline set, I realized, oh, well, I have an opportunity now to bring in different facets of the DC universe that I never got to play with back when I was writing Superman. My Superman was very earthbound and didn't go out into space really at all. But I'm a big fan of a lot of that stuff. The Legion of Superheroes, Green Lantern, Adam Strange. I grew up on that stuff. So now to get a chance to sort of dip into those worlds and some aspects of those characters, I'm getting a kick out of that most of all. Like issues 6 and 7 is a sort of a 2-part story that is very, in a lot of ways, from content to how we're telling the story, is a total Legion of Superheroes tribute, and more specifically a Keith Giffen tribute, because I'm a big Keith Giffen fan, and it's he was a big influence on me. So to be able to tell the story in a way that allows me to play in those sandboxes is I'm getting a big kick out of that aspect of it for sure.
I mean, I read, like I said, I read the first issue. I think you're killing it. It was a great story. Like I said, you have some, especially those quotes. I think were fantastic. Mr. Casey, it has been an absolute honor to talk with you, sir, and I hope you come back.
Well, happy to.
Thank you so much, sir.
Sure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Versus Stars podcast. Please help me battle the algorithms by liking and subscribing. Be sure to return for the next episode when the legendary comic book writer Marv Wolfman boards the mothership. Until next voyage, travel on.